Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society digital pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and the making and filling of large wooden horses. At a corner table by the fire are 4 people. One of them should not be left with woodworking tools unsupervised. And that's me, Evangeline Denmark. Welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. Today we're going to be traveling back to ancient Troy with some very special friends of Anselm Artist Guild. But before I introduce them, I want to welcome my co-host, Christina. If I'm not mistaken, you own your own tools.
What kind of tools?
Like woodworking tools. I remember you made your daughter blocks one year.
Oh, yes. You know what? I've been thinking about those. I've been missing it. It's terrible. I don't own woodworking tools. I borrowed them from a friend, but I do still own all the paints and the stencils that I used to paint and stencil them and seal them after that. So yes,
that counts.
I've been missing a project like that, and I was kind of thinking, I wonder if there's any other child I could make a set of blocks for.
Yeah. You have the crafting ability.
Good memory.
I do not have that. When it comes to building, painting, I let my husband do that. Basically anything that you do with your hands, I am not good at unless it's writing. So thankfully we're going to be talking about writing tonight, focusing on storytelling. We've been looking forward to our conversation with A.D. Rhine, who we know as Ashlee Cowles, former Artist Guild member, and Danielle Stinson. Ashlee and Danielle co-authored Horses of Fire, a retelling of the Trojan War from the perspective of women. I devoured this book and came away feeling seen and honored as a woman.
Samesies.
And that was an unexpected gift. I mean, I don't know why that was unexpected because these 2 ladies are amazing authors, but I just did not expect to find that in a story about ancient Troy. So let's get into it. Normally, we would start with some get to know you questions, but I had an idea to do things a little differently tonight. We'll see how it works. Ashlee and Danielle, you guys are going to be our guinea pigs.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Formally and officially welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yay. So in every podcast intro, amongst our little attempts at jokes, you also hear us state our goal for Believe to See podcast. I tried to emphasize it, but we'll do it again to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. I thought we would use that framework tonight to delve into this amazing book, Horses of Fire, and also get to know the amazing women who wrote it. So we're going to start with big picture and move inward to the circumstances that allowed Horses of Fire to come about. And don't worry, you are definitely going to get to know Ashlee and Danielle through that process. So we're starting with the great story. Here at Anselm, when we talk about the great story, we're talking about the story God is telling throughout time and reality as we know it and as we don't know it. So that includes creation, fall, redemption, restoration. We talk about them as 4 acts. So we're going to start with talking about the great story. Is there a particular act or theme that you feel applies or comes through in Horses of Fire?
Yeah, that's really interesting because, when we talk about the myths of Troy and the Trojan War, I think we often talk about the fall of Troy. So we know that part's in there. And it's interesting to think about the other parts of the great story and like how can we see those in this myth. And I think what I find compelling is because the Iliad and the Odyssey are, you know, some of the earliest and most foundational texts in the West. You know, the story doesn't necessarily end on the most hopeful note. And you kind of have to search and say, is there any redemption here in this ultimately tragic story? Spoiler alert, you know, Troy, the Trojans are the losers. It's been several thousand years. So if you weren't, sorry, it's a spoiler. But you know, you know, is there any redemption, restoration there? And I think if you look at like the tradition as a whole, you can really see that movement. You know, there's other myths, many other myths. We often think of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, but there's all these other myths about Troy, including, you know, some might call it Roman fan fiction, the Aeneid by Virgil, which takes, you know, one of the survivors of Troy, Aeneas, and has him wandering the Mediterranean for a while and then ultimately founding Rome. And so that's kind of the idea of the city of Troy being reborn in a new place, because we have like this small remnant of survivors who go on to found a new Troy. So if you kind of look at like the whole tradition, you can see the great story, I think, more clearly. For us, I think specifically like what we were envisioning and thinking about when we were writing Horses of Fire and also Daughters of Bronze. I should mention this is a duology, so kind of the full arc is across 2 books. But we were really, you know, we weren't thinking about this consciously, you know, having these 4 acts, but I think there was this sense that, you know, the stories we love most, they're often very gritty, very real, but they do have, you know, that they end on a note of hope. There is this sense that, you know, all is not lost, no matter how difficult things become, or you know, what the characters go through. And so that's the challenge I think we wanted to give ourselves is, you know, how do we take the story of the fall of Troy that's incredibly tragic, that does not end well for many of the characters we're going to create and fall in love with, but also end on some kind of a note of hope or redemption, you know, like the eucatastrophe that Tolkien talks about, where, you know, it seems like all hope is lost, but suddenly there's this like sudden turn of events, or maybe that's not the case. And we wanted to be true to the myth, but I think we also wanted to you know, aim for that. But you have to wait until book 2 comes out to see if we do it.
When I was like writing this, I was thinking, I'm glad you mentioned Daughters of Bronze, because I was thinking the kind of the same thing, what you covered, like, oh no, I'm worried now for the characters that I love, but I trust Danielle and Ashlee to have some, you know, some beauty and redemption there at the end. Danielle, do you want to take a stab at that? Talk about acts and themes, or, you know, what informed your writing?
Well, this is the best part about having a co-author. Oh, she just nailed that. So I can just come in here afterwards. And I would just say the one thing that I was thinking when Ashlee was talking is that if you look at history, all of history is basically going through these cycles. You know, we're talking about it in terms of, you know, what you all are doing in your podcast, but it also feels like that's what civilizations do over and over and over again. And I think that ties very closely to this time in history, which is the late Bronze Age. And I also feel like part of the redemption, and when we're looking for meaning in stories, and sometimes when we're looking for meaning in tragedy, I think it comes down to what we ultimately decided to focus on, which was individuals making choices that even if they're invisible and even if everything is stacked against them, their choices matter. And we all have that power, and that power is to affect some kind of change. And the smallest acts can sometimes have the largest ripples. And I think that's at the core of it. That is what we are kind of going for, which I think ties really well with this, and all that Ashlee just said.
That's awesome. It's so
getting
heartening.
to partner in. Go ahead, Christina.
Oh, it's okay. I literally just said one sentence, which is, that's awesome. That's so heartening.
I was thinking about how, it's kind of like what Danielle was saying is sort of how we participate in the restoration, how we participate in, making things better and in, journeying to something better just in our own little ways. And I love that you brought in the characters, because for me, it's always about character. So can you tell us maybe what for you most, like what part of the great story most influences you? I know, Ashlee, you talked about hope. Would you say that's probably your greatest emphasis or your greatest influence?
Um, I mean, maybe, but I think I definitely am drawn to stories where the fall is not brushed over like that. I do tend to be drawn to darker stories and tragic stories. Like as a kid, I loved Shakespeare. We were just talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Like I really was drawn to a sense of tragedy. And I think it was as I got older, like I started looking more for the redemption and restoration, and seeing that those could be equally deep and compelling. But yeah, I think I don't know if I could separate one from the other. Like I think the stories that are the most powerful for me are the ones that really don't gloss over, the darkest moment that really go there. And then if there is hope, it's all the more powerful because you see what it cost.
Mm-hmm.
That is a really good question. And I was trying to work my mind around it. And I feel like I'm also personally really drawn. I mean, we are kids that were raised on, what was that? The Land Before Time, and, all those 70s and 80s.
The Last Unicorn.
The Last Unicorn, which is my favorite movie. They are not, even the kids' stories, there was no shying away from the darkness that exists. But I think it's like when you're looking at the news, or when I'm taking in information, I think right now there's a lot of darkness, and everything that you see, there's so much sometimes that it almost feels like that's all there is, and that it can break you. But then it's interesting because I think that the acts that have the most power are the ones that give off light, because you can see a million dark things and they almost all run together. And it's like there's only so much sorrow that a person can feel, but then there's like that one thing that someone does, or that one image, that one scene, and that has the power sometimes to do more to us, to affect us more profoundly than all the other things. And I think in the end, that's what I find to be the most powerful. And it is like the contrast, I guess, but it is like what moves me.
Yeah. Really kind of digging into the human experience. Before we leave this topic, Christina, do you want to weigh in on the great story? Maybe what you saw reflected in the pages of Horses of Fire?
Oh, goodness. So many things. I mean, the one thing I really loved about your novel, you both, is just how rich it was. I mean, it was a tapestry of flavors, of characters, of perspectives, but it was so beautifully unified. It was just so rich in the fullness of a narrative, and you really felt immersed in a culture, but also in its people, and people's plural. And so I guess, as far as your question, Evangeline, I'm actually totally forgetting it right now, because I was just totally going back in my mind's eye to the story and thinking of your characters. What is this exact question, Evangeline?
I was asking if there was a particular act that, you saw reflected in the pages that really stood out to you. If that was creation, fall, or redemption,
Okay,
restoration.
like an act of the great story.
Yes.
Got it. Well, I mean, given that it's a I don't know, but do you call it a duology? I have no idea. When it's a 2-book series, what do you call it? Is it a duology?
Yeah, that's
I
it.
think
Yeah.
that's, yeah,
That's awesome. I totally just made that up. Okay, cool.
you nailed it. It was like,
Spot on.
Thank you. I didn't make it up. I just guessed. It was just this random guess. But anyway, so yeah, given that it's a 2-book series, like a duology, I would say, I mean, like there was definitely a great emphasis on hope. I would say, kind of like you were saying, Ashlee, if I'm just kind of looking back through each of the character arcs, and there's a huge sense of courage. There's lots of courage, lots of carrying on in the midst of struggle and turmoil and self-doubt and even personal relationship strife. There's a lot of carrying on and doing the next right thing. And yet it's so vivid, it's so real, it's so textured. And it's not something where you would kind of expect to be like, oh, okay, so what is the next choice the character makes? Okay, yeah, that was probably the right choice. It's like, no, like you really are living in these characters' brains and their skins and kind of thinking, I know what I want them to do, but I believe that they're so real. What are they going to do in this situation? And yeah, I feel like you really did bring that alive. But given that it's a 2-book series, and obviously I don't want to give anything away for our listeners, but even the end of the first book, Horses of Fire, that we're talking about tonight, I felt a deep sense of hope in the end, even in the face of coming destruction.
yay!
Yeah.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you.
Yes, you're welcome. Absolutely.
We're delighted. We're delighted to hear that.
Yay. Good. Well, there you go.
That's interesting. Like, I feel that the end, I mean, yes, there was hope and, resolution, but then that very last chapter, it'll like, so to talk about it, listeners, go get this book so that I can talk with you, whoever you are, about it. Because the very end hints at the coming fall, and it's just so moving, and I was just like gobbling it up and going, oh my gosh, like the things that they were revealing. And it's really written in verse, right, at the end. I'm trying to remember
Pretty
that
much, yeah.
chapter. Yeah.
It's a
combination. Like I could just, I'll just flip through it. Even no. I have the book right here.
it's its own mission.
It's its own thing.
What's that word? Yes, I know words. I promise. Totally read our book, guys.
It stands out and it hints at what's coming in such a good way. And I know sometimes like you get to the end of a book and you read that chapter that they'll give you of the next book or whatever, and you're just like, I don't know, it just kind of falls flat because you've just come to the crescendo and everything is good, and then you like move into this next thing and you're just disoriented. Actually, there was some disorientation here, but in the best way with this character that you did. And I just thought it was absolutely riveting, and it just made me want Daughters of Bronze immediately.
Thank you for that. And we just want to say that it is interesting that you said that because, and for anybody who's listening who's interested, the end of the first book, we actually begin before the events of the Iliad, which is meant to cover a 10-year war. So we're digging into the parts that, are not covered even by Homer. You're like, what's going on? What's going on in this place for this long? And so by the time we get to the end of Horses of Fire, the main events of the Iliad, and we touch on a few of them, but the main events are about to start happening. So we wanted to leave the reader with the sense that it's really all the pieces are in place now, and it's about to really, really go down.
Yes. And it was all written as one book. So I think that is interesting too, like where it does end, that it's very intentional, but it was, we already knew where everything was going, it was already written. So it wasn't like we wrote one book and then we were going to write a second one. So it was all, it's meant to definitely point to what comes next.
What comes next? Yeah.
Can you tell our audience what the release date is for Daughters of Bronze so they know? Or do you
We don't
have
we don't have an exact date, but we believe
Okay.
it's November 2024. So
Okay.
next fall.
Okay, great.
Nice.
Yes.
But we're turning in our
Nice.
copy edits, like our final copy edits, so there should be advanced reader copies available on
Yeah.
not too long.
I volunteer.
I think.
I volunteer too. I volunteer as trivia.
Well, since Danielle was mentioning it, talking about the events in the Aeneid, let's go ahead and move into talking about great stories. And so we're talking about, classics of literature that inform us, throughout the ages. So what I'm most interested in when it comes to, talking about the Aeneid, talking about the Iliad, do you guys hold those sacred? Or do you feel that, there's room for interpretation? Because obviously you have some characters in here who are just mentioned in these classic works, and you have created a whole world around them. And I'll just go ahead and spill the beans. I feel that it's very honoring to the sources. But how did you approach that? Did you feel nervous about that?
Thank you so much for saying that. I think the thing that made, honestly, the person we were most nervous about giving this book to was my dad.
True. Very true.
Who raised me on this. And, and so the people who love the Iliad love it so passionately. And I think we wanted to stay true to the essence of the characters, to the things that inspired us when we were young and that impressed upon us when we were reading it. But I think that the mythology, really participating in the tradition that is mythology, which is as old as humans have been telling stories, is to adapt them and to change them. I think it's an integral part of the tradition. And I think that when you look back at mythology and even reimaginings of myths, they tell us so much more about the times in which they're written, sometimes even than when, the times that they're talking about. And I think that's because we put ourselves in them. And I think that's what myths are meant to do. They're meant to connect us to the meaning, to what it means to be human, all those big questions that you guys ask, that we ask. And I think that's why people turn to them over and over. But so we wanted to stay true to I guess, the spirit of it, but we felt like there was room to play. But the way that we handled it, honestly, the thing that set us free was viewing it less as a myth and more as history. So our approach was to take the events of the Trojan War, or the series of events that might have inspired it, and to look at what was going on in the world at that time. And what we discovered is that, when Homer wrote it all down, if there was a Homer, he was describing stories that have been passed down for hundreds of years that were based on actual events. And so we were like, okay, we're going to go back and we're going to see, what was so important, what was so special. And by focusing on the history, I think it really opened up the world for us, because we were able to ask less like, what did Homer write who wasn't even there? It was hundreds of years after he was alive. It's like, what might have actually happened? And that allowed us to delve into like the gritty history, all the things that were going on in the world at that time, the richness. And I feel like that is what interested us more, and kind of opened up the scope of what we were able to do.
Awesome.
That's interesting. Okay. I love that. I personally love historical fiction, but that's partly because I think history is so important, and a lot of people in my generation were kind of raised with it the wrong way, in the sense of like, it's a whole bunch of facts to memorize, as instead of like, actually, this is like still living and breathing stuff, guys. Like, knowing this will affect you and your offspring, for generations to come. But anyway, so what I love about historical fiction done well is that the authors / authors in your cases, really can bring the past to life. And especially using myth, which is, by the way, a very, very, very big talent. The fact that you guys could combine history and myth together so believably, well done. But anyway, I love that. And I love that you guys went to history for that, because I personally, as I was reading it, I just felt it was so real, because there was so much history, because there was so much reference to a place and what it looked like and the kinds of things that they dressed in. Like, it was just so there. Like, I still have this very vivid picture in my mind of everything. And that's hard to do when you're actually retelling a myth, right? I mean, you're kind of usually like, I'm just going to tell the basics of the bones of the story and make up the rest. But in my opinion, like, I could really tell that you guys were definitely doing your homework. Sounds so lame, but you guys really did like respect the time period and the fact that these stories, or the story, though myth / myths, really were written by real humans referencing a particular period of history that humans lived. And I don't know, maybe that was a little convoluted, but I love that.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, and I think, you know, the changes that we did make to the story, like any kind of major changes, like that was definitely in our mind, is like, how do we change it to make it more likely to be what maybe historically happened. And a big part of that was, you know, we were telling the story from the Trojan side, and in Homer, he's a Greek, and he's, you know, writing from like the victor's position, or, you know, perspective. And the Trojans, you know, when you read the Iliad, you don't really get a sense that they're a different culture. It almost just feels like, you know, they're have the same culture as the Greeks. And so that was something we were really passionate about as we like dug into this Bronze Age history and learned like the Trojans might have been based off of a people known as the Luwians, and they were potentially vassals of the Hittite Empire. Like there was this huge world. Like the word Hittite is not mentioned in the Iliad, but that was like a huge force at that time. So I think that was really liberating for us, is just to be like, the things we are changing, it's because we're trying to give a bigger picture, not like a more narrow one. And then, you know, I definitely agree with what Danielle said. Like, I think we hold the great conversation sacred more so than like any particular version of the story. In the sense that there wasn't just one. Like the Iliad is the one that is the most well known, and but there were many versions of the Trojan War story told, you know, with different versions of Helen. Like there's one where she's in Egypt during the whole war, and
she got to skip it, guys. Yeah, she got to skip it,
and she's like hologramming herself in like Princess Leia style. Like it's a very like so, and yeah, like so there wasn't. So I guess we felt like, okay, like if our version of Helen's going to be slightly different than what is in the Iliad, like it's been done before. So if people were doing it in the ancient world, we feel like we can do it now.
We could have gone ancient aliens, is what we're saying, but we restrained ourselves.
Yes.
I mean, you could have gone like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull style with like,
very much. Very much. Okay, it was on the table.
It was on the table.
But also, just to think about, like, people, and that's the thing that a lot of people don't know, is they consider the Iliad just a myth, and that's a historical evolution too. Because in the classical period, everybody was like, "Oh yeah, totally happened."
Yeah,
they visited Alexander the Great's like, this is the place to be. All greatness comes here. It was very accepted, and then only recently, because now we tend to look at everything that doesn't adhere to our very strict idea of what facts are and what is, like, you know, and we say, oh, everything in the past, because there were some gods in it, or, you know, things that were mystical, like that it was all made up.
Right.
And, you know, newsflash, history and myth were synonymous for thousands of years of human evolution. Like that's how people understood their world. That's how people recorded what happened in the past. And so you cannot just discard it and say that it wasn't, that there's no value to it.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about the hagiographies of the saints, and you know how so much in that is myth, and you know, and I love that. You know, that is how, like you were saying, how people learned about their world and understood their world, and so yes, absolutely, they are married to each other, and you can't separate them. I think you guys both kind of touched on, you know, what sparked the most interest, at least in terms of, you know, let's tell the Trojan side. You know, things are more open to interpretation than we might know. Are there characters? I mean, you mentioned Helen, and I really love what you do with Helen in here. I love the different characterizations of the women. You see 3 and then 4 very different experiences, and they are all just looked at and written and crafted with such grace. Is there one of the characters that particularly, ignited your interest? Talk a little bit about making those characters from, from what was there, the bones of the story that we had passed down to us.
Yeah, so I taught at a classical high school for a little while, and we spent a whole semester reading the Iliad, and like one of my prized moments as a teacher was when I walked into the class and one of my students had written on the board a giant heart that said Hector plus Andromache in it. And I was like, okay, this is the highlight of my teaching career. Like, and so I would definitely say like that like you only get hints of it in the story. There's like in book 6 of the Iliad, there's like this very moving, it's one of the most famous scenes in the epic, the farewell scene. But in it, there's like all these hints that there's so much more going on in this relationship. That it's probably not just like a typical like royal arranged marriage that might have taken place at that time. So yeah, I think like exploring Andromache, like I think there's a line where it says something like she gives her husband counsel. And that kind of sparked this question like, well, her husband's the commander of Troy's army. So what kind of advice is she giving him? And that kind of, allowed us to explore like, what would maybe some of her skills be? What kind of person would she, she's his loyal wife. And that's definitely how she is portrayed in the original. But like beyond that, what else is going on there? So I think that was definitely a huge draw just from my early days of teaching it and just seeing how that relationship spoke to 10th graders thousands of years later and really wanting to really unpack that and explore it.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and we're all just a little bit in love with Hector. Like
that as well.
This is the way. Just keeping it real for the listeners here. No, but for me personally, I think that there are some characters. So Cassandra and Helen were done so dirty by history. I think that they took the fall, and we were so interested in taking these women who are portrayed as being powerless and showing how they had power. And that is one of the things I think that motivated us to write as well, because it didn't feel right with our own experiences. And if we're looking at myths and saying how they show us things that are real, that was where the disconnect was for us. And we thought we could go in and show a different take. And also I think there are some of my favorite characters growing up in the Iliad were some of the lesser known characters, like Ajax the Great, or, like Sarpedon. Some of the best speeches are given by these or Akamas, like these men that come out, and then, they all have their own little stories, but some of those are the most vibrant moments. And we wanted to take it away from just the big names. And we wanted, the Achilles Patroclus story, which has been done so beautifully by Madeline Miller and others. We wanted to shine the light on places where it hasn't been. And there's some really good stuff there.
And that it's probably worth mentioning, we're both soldiers' daughters. So I think that there was a bit of that too, of like, we know how soldiers talk. Like and some of these, the characters that Danielle mentioned, like being able to see people that we grew up around, like in this epic that's thousands of years old, and seeing like, okay, some things remain the same. Like you can there was a sense of familiarity there that we thought we could kind of bring to the story to some of those lesser known characters.
That's such a strong theme throughout the book is, women's suffering and endurance and strength in times of war. And that was one of the things that I felt was truly honoring to women and to our experiences, whether in, times of war or, in just going through the struggles of life. So I think you guys did that so well. And yeah, taking the characters, the unsung heroes and heroines, and giving them their light, um, you know, was truly brilliant in my opinion.
Thank you.
So well done. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about books that influence you other than, the Iliad and all of that? Where I'm thinking, especially because this is such an epic story, and I'm like, these ladies must be fans of epics. But whatever it is that you guys are that you feel are influences in your writing journey, would love to hear about it.
Yeah, so it will probably come as no surprise that I grew up reading a lot of war stories, being a soldier's daughter, and also because of our experiences, we were like, that's just one of the things that I was always interested in. Ashlee and I spent many a car ride also watching, like Gladiator and Braveheart. So these are one of the things that drew us together initially. But I grew up with Mishner. The Bridges at Tokori was one of my favorite books. I remember my dad putting that in my hand. Steinbeck, The Moon is Down, another one of my favorites. All Quiet on the Western Front. And then I went from the classics into like the Ken Folletts and, all those sweeping historical epics. But I also have a strong footing in epic fantasy, which is my other passion. So the Tolkien, even the gritty stuff like the grimdark Joe Abercrombie, I love it all. And when I was a kid, I remember reading Tamora Pierce and The Witcher, and just thinking to myself, like, I love how you can see so much truth sometimes in fiction, particularly in fantasy, because it sets us free to explore things that otherwise we might be hesitant to explore. So all those things kind of inspired my love of epic and of, wide-reaching tales. But then I also have to say that some of my favorite authors are, we previously wrote in the young adult space, and two of my favorite authors, Melina Marchetta and Kath Crawley, write young adult from the first person. And there was something about the voice, like there's something about a first person voice done beautifully that is so powerful. And I think what interested me in this book was combining the wide scope and the epic scale with that very close personal first person immediacy, which might make some of these time periods and things more accessible for a modern reader, like really put them in the trenches, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think Danielle touched on Tolkien. Like, we definitely bonded over Lord of the Rings as teens, and I think we kind of looked at this story and said, like, the Trojan War, it's an epic poem, but it feels like it could be read as like this epic fantasy novel, and that's kind of the atmosphere that we were going for, like when we sat down to write, is to give it that epic scope and feel of like some of our favorite historical fantasy. And that's really what I read a lot, especially when I was younger. I still read a lot of historical fiction today, but as a teen I read devoured The Mist of Avalon, and that was like this big moment of like seeing a classic myth, like a Arthurian legend, told from the female point of view. There'd be some things I think if I go back and read it now, I'd have some issues with. But at the time, it was like this, like, wow, you could hear about the story of Arthur from a woman's perspective. And then definitely like sweeping historical fiction with a touch of fantasy. Stephen Lawhead, who wrote Byzantium, Patrick. And then, I think I've mentioned probably every Anselm event I've ever been to, because I'm constantly preaching about Christian Lavransdatter. But that's, it's one of my favorite novels. It's a historical novel set in medieval Norway. And the thing I love about it is it has a huge scope, but by the end of it, and it feels so distant, in the sense of like you feel like you are going really far into the past in a world that is so different from our world. But the characters by the end of it feel so real. And it's a story all about motherhood. And, I think that was something we really wanted to bring to this too, is we cared so much about the characters feeling real and that people would connect not just with like the world building and this epic story, but with these women specifically. So those were definitely some of my big influences.
Nice. It can be hard to balance the world building and the characterization. I think that's one of the hardest things about writing fantasy and about, I mean, I would classify epic, any epic kind of in that category, as well as being hard to balance the two, because story world is so important. But without character, you can have an amazing story world and nobody cares.
Very true.
So I have got to read that. What is the name of the book again? The one that you were talking about, Ashlee?
Christian Lavern's daughter.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It's brilliant.
I've
It's just like, it's unbelievable. Yeah. She sent it to me and then I read it and was a disaster for a certain amount of time afterwards. It's honestly one of the best depictions of motherhood, especially of, I don't know, like the bond in early motherhood that I have ever read.
Neat. Yeah. Okay. It's on my list. I'm going to get to it. It's being added to my TBR, which is
too
tall anyway, but it's got to happen.
We understand.
I was thinking about, you were talking to, what?
I said, we understand, like the ever-growing TBR.
Oh, yeah, yes. You understand. Yeah, too many books, so little time. Yeah, no, I was thinking about the Arthurian legend. I was introduced to the Arthurian legend, or really, I guess, the Arthurian legends. You just kind of grow up with it's sort of, in the background of Western civilization, I guess. But I was introduced to it through Lawhead as well. There's, is it Taliesin and Merlin?
Yes. He has like an Arthurian cycle.
Yeah. Right. But he also has like a Celtic cycle. Mm-hmm. I think it's called the Silver Knot.
Oh, like
I love
Talesman
and trilogy.
Yeah. I haven't read that one, but he's a great example of someone who blends like history and myth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sounds like I need to read his stuff. That's my kind of guy.
Yeah. With our pile is getting taller and taller, and yes, our time is going shorter and shorter. I don't like it. Well, let's move in even closer. We've talked a little bit about your experiences being soldiers' daughters. Let's talk about our own stories, in connection with the great stories and the great story, but particularly your stories, Danielle and Ashlee. The dedication for Horses of Fire reads, "To our mothers and grandmothers, the walls do not stand without you." And I've said before, and I'll say again, this novel is an ode to the strength and character of women. Tell us about some women in your lives, if you're willing to do that, who you feel exemplify those, that bravery, that strength.
Yeah, so I can start, but I know we're both really blessed because we have had some truly phenomenal examples and examples in our own lives to draw from. So my grandmothers, it's hard to, so my family has been involved in multiple wars throughout every generations, like many of our families have. And my grandmothers, during the Second World War, were actually on opposite sides. One was in Italy and one was here. And so I just know that it shaped so much about who they were and their toughness, their grit. And, my grandmother, my Italian grandmother, who then came to this country, I remember she's one of the people that inspired me to write, because she'd learned English after coming here. She had her children in the old country. And then because, Italy after the war, everybody, there was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of hardship. And then my grandfather came over and one by one, he brought his children over, and it took years. That process took years. And for me, the thing that is so inspiring is the fact that you would do that. You would go someplace, you would put yourself out there in such a way and be separated for so long, all for the hope of something better for somebody that is not yourself. And I think that's what I think we all need a little bit more of. And I think to me, that is the example, like that's courage, that is bravery. And that is, what I was drawn to and what I wanted to honor in their memory. And then, my mom is a soldier's wife. My dad was in the military for 30 years. And as most people will tell you, there are the wars that are fought visibly, and they're the ones that are, kind of behind the scenes. And they're the way that hardship and sometimes difficulty brings people together. It allows for some of the best aspects of humanity to come through. Not that you would want to wish it on anybody, but when you see it, it's pretty amazing. And that's what has impressed upon me when I was little. I just remember she would just get it done. She would, women coming together, delivering babies, and men too, because the men are military spouses, and just all the things that went into making the world safe and sort of like filling it with magic, despite all the other things that were going on. So that, for me, that we drew a lot. I drew a lot from that, and I know Ashlee did too.
Yeah,
it's really powerful.
I'm particularly remembering the scene where they're going door to door to try to get help. From the other women. It's like a crisis is going on. I won't give away too much, but it was particularly beautiful. Who came and who helped, and you just have these moments where these women they're just down and dirty getting the work done, like it's in the middle of, like I said, a crisis. And you don't see that portrayed. Like, we all know, because we've been there, like we know what it is to be in the muck of things and kind of taking care of what needs to be taken care of. Like, do the next thing, do the next thing, do the next thing. And, it's not glorious. It's just drudgery sometimes. And sometimes it's just heartbreaking. And you showed that, and you showed the women coming together. And, that was one of the places where I was like, they really, really are, are giving respect to the, our experience as women and to what you guys have experienced as well. So Ashlee, please tell us about a woman or women in your life who have shown that to you.
Yeah, well, I think your example is like a perfect segue into that, because Danielle and I, we've known each other since we were 15. We grew up not just on a military base, but on a military bases. But when we met in high school, it was on a base in Germany, which is a very interesting experience. It's probably the most close-knit community I've ever been a part of. It's really hard to describe, but you're like in this little American island so you have like the best of both worlds. You have like home, and then you also are experiencing this other culture at the same time and are getting kind of immersed in it. But like that example of the women going door to door, like we don't have like an exact transference of that, but I think it was the sense of like, that's what we grew up around. That when our base emptied because most of the soldiers were going down in the 1999 Kosovo conflict, like there was just this sense of people rallying together, those left behind, and supporting one another and watching each other's kids. And just like, it's like, that is the world we grew up in. And it's only being out of that that I think we both like see what a blessing that was and how rare that is in our world today. It's like, I wish we had more of that, but it was just kind of this natural, like we talk a lot about like intentional community, and I know Anselm is big on that, and that is so needed. And it was such a privilege to actually see that was organic, that wasn't, people weren't having to intend that. It was just how life was. And yeah, a lot of that was, our moms, the other spouses that we got to know, and just kind of this bigger family that we felt like we were a part of. And that really, relates to, we talk a lot about like the shadows in Horses of Fire. There's lots of references to like those people who are acting behind the scenes, and who, may not get all the accolades, but they're making things happen. and the visible war that's being fought wouldn't be possible without those people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think we definitely both witnessed a lot of that growing up, which we're
sure.
very fortunate.
Yeah, and I think it's like, this is me kind of going off on a tangent, but it's in my head, so, and it's probably 9 o'clock, so you're all going to get it. But it is interesting how we're so connected now with all these different things, but I think in some ways we're so disconnected from each other. And I think both Ashlee and I, because of our experiences and sort of like even our own friendship, and what that has given to both of our lives, I think the people that we admire most in the world are the ones that are less focused on what is happening out here and who is watching. And it's less about saying the right thing and more about doing the right thing and showing up to get it done. You have to be perfect, but you have to show up. And I think that is sort of at odds with how a lot of things kind of look, and like the pressures even that our kids are under and all these other things. I feel like they're taking it back was really something that we wanted to do. Just like you said, it's like, who shows up? Sometimes the people that show up for you are the ones that surprise you. They're not the ones that you would expect. And I think that we wanted to, like, that was such a perfect example, because I think that that's something we wanted to show too, is like, you know, you don't know until you're tested, and you don't know until you're in that moment and you know who's really like in your camp and who isn't.
Mm-hmm. And we don't know what we're missing. And then, something happens and we have to rely on others. And it really is a gift in a way. It's a gift you don't want. And then, and because you don't want the hardship, but then coming through that and having, it's usually women quite often, it's women who show up at your door with a casserole, and yeah, we don't know what we're missing. Like I said, we've lost so much when it comes to community. And you're right. Yes, Anselm is trying to just be a little voice, saying, "Hey, this is what humans need." More of this. Yeah. Christina, do you want to weigh in on anything? We are running low on time, but did you have a comment or anything you want to leave us with?
Oh, I mean, so many things. And yeah, I apologize. I lost internet for part of that there. So I know I missed so much goodness, and I'm kicking the modernity and saying, how dare it, betray me. But, that's how it is. But actually, one of the things that I was thinking about in your characters that I wanted to mention is, and what we were just talking about, what you guys were just talking about, as far as the nobility of the small acts, is a quote by George Eliot.
Christina,
did you already say it?
I have this on my notes as like, let's close the podcast with this quote. Because
are you serious? From Middlemarch?
Yes, because we were going to put the we were going to. So thank you. We are on the same wavelength. That's amazing.
It's at the beginning of book 2 also. It'll be the first thing you read when you open that.
Wait, are you serious? Oh my gosh. That is hilarious, you guys. That is one of my favorite quotes of all time. Okay, you know what? Look at that. Just look at that.
Please.
Okay.
Please.
So I shouldn't say it yet. I'll let y'all say it at the very end.
Share it.
Please share it.
Perfect. Share it?
Yes. Okay. All right. Marianne Evans, also known by her pen name George Eliot, says this beautiful quote in the book Middlemarch. She says, "For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been, is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs."
That's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one.
Beautiful.
That is hilarious. Well, look at you guys. You guys just did such an amazing job that for me, you brought that to mind. How look at that.
Well, that's probably the best compliment you could give us. So thank you, Christina.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. That's the thesis statement of the whole
of the whole thing.
The whole book. Underlined it. Underlined it.
I'm going to bed proud tonight.
Well, thank you, Danielle and Ashlee, for sharing your gifts with us, for being with us tonight, and especially for Horses of Fire. Let us know, let our listeners know where they can find you online.
Yeah, we have a website, adrhine.com, and you can find our newsletter, everything about our books, our story there. And then we also are pretty active, well, sometimes active. Now we're going back into the writing cocoon now. So social media is falling by the wayside a little bit because we're like, we want to actually write books now. But we're on Instagram as well.
Mm-hmm. And we have a book club kit that Penguin made for our book. So anybody who's interested in that, they can also find that resource.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, with questions and historical context. It's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
That is cool. Did you guys make up those questions, or did Penguin do that?
They did it. Yeah.
They did it.
Oh,
I know. I was like, these are good questions. I better know how to answer them.
So that's A is in Ashlee, D is in Danielle, Rhine is in the Rhine River, because you guys met in Germany.
Yep.
So adrhine.com.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And listeners, if there's a strong woman in your life, you need to get her Horses of Fire. At the time of this recording, it is November and Christmas is coming. So you heard it from me.
Evangeline. Good point.
Horses of Fire for every strong woman in your life, and the men too, because it's wonderful. All right, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers and the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believed to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have a few minutes here or there to rate and review our show, we would love that on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.